Well, it's called instead of a book, because it is in fact letters. And it is extremely improper, I think, to have a collection of your letters made while you're still alive. My letters began about 30-odd years ago, when I heard from a man in New York who had been for years a close friend of a man who I had published, called Alfred Chester. And Alfred was an eccentric and difficult person, brilliant writer, I thought. We never succeeded in selling his books at all well. He went mad and he died in very sad circumstances in Israel. Having had 1 year in New York when he became famous, when everyone recognized him as one of the really brilliant writers, and he did a lot of reviewing, and he was a name. And his friend Edward Field, a long time after his death, thought that it was time to bring him back bring his reputation up again, and perhaps get him his books published again. And knowing that I'd been his publisher in England, he wrote to me and said, "Have you got anything of Alfred's? Any memories of Alfred, any letters of Alfred's that would help?" I wrote back saying, of course I had, and remembering suddenly and vividly the frightful occasion when one morning the telephone operator downstairs had rung me up and said, "There's someone here to see you, Diana." And her voice suggested emergency of some sort. And I went downstairs, and there was Alfred, sitting looking very morose. I hadn't heard from him or seen him for a long time. So I said, "Oh, Alfred, how lovely to see you. Come upstairs." And he came upstairs and he said, "I've come here now to ask you to tell the Prime Minister to stop the voices." And I said, "Well, I don't actually know the Prime Minister. What are these voices?" And he then told me that terrible voices were talking to him night and day and driving me absolutely mad. And I had actually suggested to him last week when he was in Marrakesh that he might come to London. I said, "But Alfred, love, I wasn't in Marrakesh." And he gave me a very dirty look and said, "You were." And he quoted what I'd been saying. And it occurred to me that if I went on saying I wasn't there, I might become one of these awful people who were saying the voices. And I said, well, how can I help now you're here?" And he said, "By approaching the Prime Minister." I said, "Well, as I don't know him, do you think a Member of Parliament would do?" And he said, "Well, he supposed it would." And I got rid of him then. He said that he was in a bad way. Did I have any typing that needed to be done? Because that would be a way of silencing the voices, rather. And actually, by a miracle, we did have something that needed typing, and I gave it to him. And also, did I know a good dentist? And I said yes, and so I made an appointment for a dentist, and he went away. And I very quickly, I didn't know who to telephone. I didn't know many people who were good about madness. But I telephoned, I can't remember who it was, and they said, "Well, don't you think perhaps you should get on to," oh dear, what was he called, that famous man? Sorry? Ronnie Lane, that's right. Get on to him. He was away. Someone said, "Well, he has a buddy who might do instead." So I got on to him and said, "What ought I to do?" And he said, "Well, if you've promised to get on to the Prime Minister for him, you've got to do it. You mustn't break your promises, that you must keep it. And then perhaps I will see him." I rang up a Member of Parliament who I didn't know very well, explained the situation. And he said, "Are you mad? Do you know how many people come to us every week about their bloody voices? I thought, well, what am I to do? Alfred came back, and I thought, well, the only thing to do, probably he's only come to me because secretly, in some part of him, he wants to be sent to a doctor. Most of his friends are tremendously unsquare, unstraight people who wouldn't think in terms of doctors. I'm about the only person he knows who obviously would think in terms of doctors. So maybe if I tell him the truth, that I can't get on to anyone, but that I found him a doctor, maybe he will go. So I did, and I was right. He was really, a part of him was wanting to go to a doctor. So he agreed to go to this man. And I sank back in great relief. And the man said he couldn't actually take him on himself, but he would find someone who would talk to him and might talk him through it. And that is what happened. Alfred didn't really care for this doctor. He said, I don't like him at all. He looks like an Irish bookie. I thought that he might rather like that, actually, but he didn't. I think perhaps the man did look rather like an Irish bookie, because he did drink himself to death shortly afterwards. But anyhow, poor old Alfred finally went back to Morocco, where he'd been staying. And all this came back to me, and I wrote to Edward, who had written to me, describing this awful occasion. And he wrote back, and we started writing to each other. And he, very soon afterwards, he was a poet, is a poet, and he got awarded a Prix de Rome, and he went through England on his way to Rome and came to see me with his very dear boyfriend called Neil Dennis. And within 5 minutes, we realized that we were going to be friends. It's odd, you sometimes meet a person and you know absolutely at once that this is someone to whom you could say anything. And Edward was that for me at once. And I was for him too. And we began writing letters to each other. And that was the beginning of something which you don't expect to find when you're in your 70s, which I almost was then. A friend. I mean, one does meet many, many acquaintances, but you don't often make a real friend when you get old. Edward and Neil, between them, became really my best friends for the next, until now. And it all took place, not entirely through letters. Every year they came to England for a bit. But it was mostly through letters. And I'd been quite right. I mean, you could say absolutely anything to Edward. He's about the only poet who I can comfortably read. I'm not very good at reading poetry. I think the language as being something to communicate with. And if people communicate in ways very obscure, but you almost have to learn a code in order to understand, it makes me impatient. I don't like it. Edward, who was at one time a very fashionable poet in America, went out of fashion and now he's coming back. Edward has a firm belief that poetry should be as easy to understand as prose, if not easier. And his is. He writes in the language of common life. He writes about things that have really happened. He writes very indiscreetly about very private things. And I love reading his poetry, which was a great help. And as time came nearly after, I suppose about 29 years, when he said, Neil and I have decided that your letters ought to be published. It turned out that Neil is blind. They've been living together for years and years and years, and Edward spends a lot of his time trying to think of things to keep occupying Neil. Neil gets rather impatient with life, not being able to see. And one of the things he'd done was he had read one of my letters every night to Neil. And Neil, who is a touch typist, a very good touch typist, had typed them out. And they'd got this immense pile of letters. I mean, it's really a formidable pile. And they both decided these letters should be published. And I said, you can't possibly publish someone's letters when they're still alive. It's indecent. People must be dead. And so they got silent about that for a bit. And then he did a rather sly thing. Oh, I said to him, if when I'm dead, you want to publish my letters, I give you the copyright. Copyright in letters is rather complicated. The actual thing in paper, the piece of paper, so to speak, belongs to the person to whom it was sent, but the words still belong to the person who wrote them. So it's complicated. I said, I will give you that, and you can go ahead once I'm dead. He then finally said, now look, if these letters are ever published, they will have to be edited, and you're the only person who can edit them. So I'm sending them to you. And he sent me this enormous bundle, a hideous great bundle. I couldn't open it for about 3 weeks. It sort of sat in my room, and I looked at it with horror. And finally, I started to read it. And rather embarrassingly, I started to laugh. They were really rather funny, a lot of these letters. And they also made me think of all kinds, they brought back all kinds of things that I'd completely forgotten. I found myself, my God, did I really say that or do that? Or did this happen? And that was fun. But the most important thing of all was, as they went on, I realized that they are a record of something which is very, very valuable to me, which is this true friendship. It's one of the very few advantages of old age. You cease to be a sexual being, and that seems very dreary, but you then discover that as a result, you can actually love a man without wanting to go to bed with him. And that is surprisingly delightful. And Edward is my love of this kind, and Neil too, actually. They're both my loves. And it is rare affection, true affection. And that is something which is so unusual when you're old that I absolutely treasure it. And I thought, well, this bundle does actually celebrate this friendship. Perhaps it would not be quite too conceited and awful to let it be published. And I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll send this bundle to I didn't submit it to my publisher, I just sent it to someone I knew there saying, look at it. If you think there is a book here, perhaps I will get down to the editing of it. And then there was sort of silence for about 10 days, and then I got a telephone call saying, we wish to make it our bestseller for Christmas 2012. So I thought, oh my God, I'd better start editing it, which I did. It didn't need a great deal, because I took out things that would upset people or really hurt people, and there wasn't an awful lot of that. And I put in little bits of explanation, and I put in an occasional poem of Edward's. But the awful thing was, you see, the unfairness is, Edward is a keeper. As soon as he has papers, he puts them into a concertina file and keeps them. He keeps everything. I am an absolutely confirmed thrower-awayer, and I always have been. I think because I've mostly lived in rather small places, and I hate paper. I mean, paper spawns. You put down a couple of letters in a pile, and in a minute it's 12 letters. And you haven't answered any of them. And my desk used to be a horror, actually, in the office. I did know where things were, but nobody else could believe that I knew where things were. There's just hideous piles of paper. And so, well, also, when I was young, we all wrote letters. We all wrote letters the whole time. I mean, we'd finish the term at Oxford, and we'd scatter, and the next minute we would be writing to each other, describing what happened. So that I think I tended to think of letters as though they were conversation. They were ephemeral. They came and they went. You read them, you enjoyed them, you threw them away. And so I'd thrown away all Edward's letters. I mean, I'd loved getting them, but I'd thrown them all away. But it doesn't seem to really matter, because I could put in things between letters, just short bits saying what had happened. He didn't mind a bit. He doesn't fancy himself as a letter writer. And the other thing, of course, there was another argument for them, was that we could share the loot, because they're rather poor. And it could be our joint thing. And if I didn't publish it, he's younger than I am, but he's not very much younger than I am. So that he could possibly have been dead before I was. And then nobody would benefit from them. So in the end, I came to the conclusion that it was all right to publish them. And that is what I have done. And I hope it's all right. No one has yet said, what an unspeakable piece of conceitedness, which is what I feel they might think. And also another thing which appalled me to begin with, which I fought tooth and nail against, and when no one took any notice, they put my face all over it, the publishers have. So it's got a huge face of me on the front. And I thought, well, now that will be really counterproductive. Because how could you not think that someone who puts that on their book is terribly conceited? But I think people understand, really, that jackets are jackets. Tinkle? Good.